So I figured I'd make a video about how to make a Honda 300 axle paddle. This is a big red rear end. It's the rear axle tube off of one, and it's already been modified to fit a 300. On this end is where the differential normally is, and over here is where it all connects, the swing arm, whatever else. So that's where the brake drum usually goes. But first off, you gotta start by taking the 4 bolts out that go into the differential housing, and take the hitch off too, because it'll just make it easier to hacksaw it or sawzall it off. And then if you've already made a mount, then don't worry about it. But if you haven't, I would suggest making one if you're going to use a 300 mount. And just hacksaw it or sawzall it off, cut it off somewhere close to the weld, and you can always grind it later. But now that's out of the way. After that, you got to measure your axle so you know how big to make the inside of your pipe. I'm sure not everybody that watches this will probably be using a 250 Big Red or 350 Foreman differential. I don't have a 350 Foreman differential. I don't know how big the axle is, but for a 250 Big Red differential, it's around 0.95. And the way an axle paddle works, the clamp-on type is it just clamps on and you don't have to weld or do anything. And you can always remove it if for some reason you strip the axle, because I prefer not to weld it. But regardless, I'd always measure it anyway, just to be sure, because you may be that one lucky guy that somehow got one that's like 2 or 3 thousandths too big or too small compared to everyone else's. Next, you take either a piece of, I think it's 1-inch Schedule 40 pipe, or take a solid bar, and I prefer to use a solid bar just because it's what I have and it's easier. And I cut it off at about 4 1/4 inches and face the end of it off in the lathe, and I'm going to center drill it and then drill it out to, I think this drill bit is 59/64. That's what it says. Really, you want to use the one size below it, but that's just what I have, and that's how it goes. I haven't had any issues with it but once, and then I put different grade bolts in it and tightened it tighter. And I also put a very thin bead of weld on the axle paddle. But also, after you bore it out to however big you want it, or however big it needs to be, it does need to be about 5 to 9 thousandths smaller than the axle, because it has to clamp to it unless you're planning on welding it. But as far as axle paddles, I'm just making the standard 4-inch wide by 6-inch long axle paddle. It's pretty standard Honda axle paddle. I cut this from a piece of angle iron and it'll work, but it's not the best thing to use. But pretty much you just do all that, and once you get the inside drilled out, I'll pick up there. So these are 2 additions to what I said right before I cut it off, and this is actually what I said. There's 2 things that are actually wrong. One, you don't want it to be 5 to 9 thousandths. I just went back and looked to be sure. You actually want it 2 to 4, so it'll have more of a clamping surface to go against. But since this was drilled with a drill bit on a 19th century lathe, it's not going to be completely accurate. And I actually measured it, and it was 0.91, 91 or 90.5 or 91, something like that, which is like 3 thousandths smaller than the axle. So it'll have you'll have more of a clamping area. And also, if you decide to use a foot of pipe, it's not schedule 40, it's schedule 80. That's the reason why I didn't have it ever get any, because unless I order it, because it's kind of expensive, I have no way to get schedule 80 pipe, because there's none around here. All there is schedule 40, so that's why I use the solid rod. I just couldn't remember why. Next, what you do is you take two flat pieces, also 4 inches long, about the same width or a little shorter than that, in the piece to weld onto. See, they're just the tiniest bit shorter. You take that and you draw a line down the center with a square, and after you do that, you mark 9/16 and 1 5/16 and center punch them on either side from this edge and from this edge, so a total of 4 holes or 4 center marks to be drilled, and you drill them with the next size bigger than 5/16. After you get the holes drilled, you lay it out on the table like you're going to weld it, and if you're going to MIG weld it, and even no matter what you're welding it with really, you need to make sure the metal's clean, so grind it pretty clean with a grinder, or just whatever, sander. Then you have to clamp it to the table, because otherwise it will warp and draw out the edges and make everything a lot harder than it needs to be. And works best if you have welding clamps, and if you don't have a angle iron lip, and I do on this table, so I got to deal with that. But I think I got it clamped good enough that it'll be alright anyway. And if not, if it starts to warp noticeably, I'll just weld from about here to there, then turn it all around and do the other side. After you have all this welded and welded solid, you have to start adding your braces. And on the big side, this side with the two big 4x6 plates, you can use either flat bar or tubing. I used a piece of 3/4 inch tubing. You cut it at 45-degree angles, obviously, because you want half and half, because of the 90-degree angle that you made from this plate if you did it right and got it reasonably close to 90. And then on the other side, you have to use flat bar because you don't have enough room to use tubing in between where the holes are for the bolts. And you just get to sit about right. I didn't cut one of these, just the perfect angle. I think it was this one, and it doesn't really fit right. But you also will have to cut the center of it out, the center ½ inch of it out, otherwise it'll hit right here and it won't hold it, because you can see the amount of space in between it. And once again, make sure that it's all shiny and clean. Although my material's all rust pitted, it just needs to be shiny and clean to get a decent weld. And it'd be best if you could use fresh metal that hasn't been set out for 60 years or whatever, but this is just what I could come up with. Now, if you're going to put a small bead of weld on the axle, you need to C-clamp it around the axle about like I have it, where it's pretty much touching on one side to the main part of the paddle, and there's about a 1/8 inch gap at the beginning of the paddle, and it'll be less whenever there's actual bolts in it, because it'll squeeze it down. But what I like to do is C-clamp it about where it's supposed to be, and just drill the holes and move the C-clamp over to the other side, drill the other holes, and you can see there's a little bit of a gap in between there. That's because it clamps around it on the bead of weld I'm going to put on the axle, the really thin but tall bead. This is pretty much just the finished project. This is how I do it. I clamp it down all the way on one side. I'll put a small bead somewhere on the axle and clamp it around it. And I just clamp it like this just to make sure it all fit right. And I kind of screwed up because there was a big hole that was torched in the material right here. So I ended up having to drill this out to 1/2 inch and put a big 1/2 inch bolt through it with a washer. And this side all turned out fine. I just gotta put a bolt in that one still. But that's pretty much it on how to make an axle paddle. If you pay attention, have the right material, and do it right, it'll turn out probably even better than this one. This one turned out okay for what I had to work with, and it'll work. So I don't really care. I'm not going for looks anyway.